Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey Adapters, welcome back to an exciting episode. I'm partnering with the U.S. Department of Defense and showcasing some of their work in adapting cultural resources in the Pacific Islands. I traveled to Hawaii to cover the Keeping History Above Water workshop and the PICARD, Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Research and Development Conference. And yes, I bet you'll be able to figure out what inspired that acronym. These two events were combined and sponsored by the DoD. You'll hear about what cultural resources are at threat from climate change and the unique challenges Pacific Islands have in adapting to these threats. You'll also hear about some exciting adaptation technology to help islanders adapt to climate change. It was a great mix of indigenous people, adaptation experts, and government reps all converging to share their stories and approaches to adaptation. A special emphasis was placed on the Marshallese Islands, and you'll also hear from a state senator from those islands share what's at stake for the Marshallese. This is an exciting episode which will get you to rethink what you thought you knew about cultural resources and the innovative ways islands are adapting. Okay, let's take a trip to the Aloha State. Hey Adapters, joining me is Kate Plimpton. Kate is the Senior Cultural Resource Advisor in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Department of Defense. Hi Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here, Doug.
What do you do there as Senior Cultural Resource Officer?
The Department of Defense oversees cultural resource policy and initiatives. We work with each military department. They have their own federal preservation officer, and they develop guidelines and policies for their department. And then they also work with cultural resource managers at the specific installations. And so at our office, we coordinate all of that policy. We oversee cultural resource management in general, and then we also work on initiatives and larger projects. We also try to work with folks within our department. So that includes natural resources, wildland fire, Native American affairs, environmental justice, all of these projects, all these programs that have a connection with cultural resources that sit next to it. We also work pretty closely with REPI, the Readiness Environmental Protection Integration Program, as well as our environmental research and development funding arms, SERDP and ESTCP. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Design Program, Development Program, and ESTCP is the Environmental Security, Technology, and Certification Program.
My listeners will want to know, why does the Department of Defense care about cultural resources?
It's a good question. I get asked this a lot when I go to conferences and meetings. We have over 600,000 buildings and structures across the nation, as well as 27 million acres of land. In addition to there being federal laws that require us to take into account our impact on these properties, we also realize that we hold the history of the United States within some of these properties. And it's really important for us to be good stewards of that. In addition, these resources provide resiliency and mission benefits as well, whether that might be a landscape where a cultural site might exist or a building that we use as part of our mission essential duties.
Let's ground my listeners. We're here covering two events that we both attended. We got to go to Hawaii. That was fantastic. It was the Keeping History Above Water workshop and the PICARD workshop. And we're going to dig really into the PICARD workshop with Eric Rasmussen, who's coming on later. But can you give us a little bit of grounding? Like, we had these two events. What's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a saying in RMI that the U.S. hasn't been there for 80 years, that we've been there for 2 years, the term of a commander's rotation, 40 times. That's a difficult way to build relationships. It makes getting work done really hard, and it's not quite fair to our partners in the Pacific. And so the one throughput for all of that is culture. What are we protecting from these rising seas and these extreme weather events, if not our culture? So that might be the Gullah Geechee in South Carolina's Low Country. It might be the lobstering community along the Maine coast. That might be the Aleut community in St. Paul, Alaska, which is facing the loss of snow crabs. All of that is culture, right? The goal of KEHA and PICARD was really to share these spaces, share these speakers and attendees so that we can connect the on-the-ground science that Castle is doing with the community that's concerned about the impacts from climate change.
KEHA, the Keeping History Above Water, is a unique thing. And we're going to hear from Margaret back later in this episode to give a little bit of history there. But why did you see that as a valuable tool to talk about these issues?
The Marshallese who participated in KEHA and in PICARD are facing existential threats from coastal inundation right now. They also happen to be home to an important military installation that faces some of the same threats that the community itself is facing. So having a conversation with the community about rising seas is essential not just for protection of DoD resources, but for protection of the community as a whole. Keeping History Above Water has a record of bringing together scientists, leadership, as well as the community to have these really important discussions. This is the kind of solution building that's going to require everyone's participation. And so it was really important for us at the DoD to make sure that we're starting these conversations now in the Pacific.
We're going to hear from a lot of folks that attended both these events, and then I'm going to get you back at the very end of the episode and get more of your thoughts about how these things unfolded. So even though we're post-conference here, I'm going to have you back on at the very end to wrap things up. So I'll see you at the end of the episode, Kate.
Sounds good.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Dr. Eric Rasmussen. Eric is the Principal Scientist and Research Director at CASTLE. Hi, Eric. Welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here. Thank you very much.
I just said CASTLE because I didn't want to take an attempt pronouncing this, but tell me what that stands for.
Sure. That's the Kwajalein Atoll Sustainability Laboratory on Ibai Island within Kwajalein Atoll in the Republic of the Marshall Islands.
A bit about this laboratory. What do you guys do there?
Sure. We are looking at ways to adapt to climate change for people who have very few resources in areas that are undergoing a lot of threat. When we have a look around the world, we see that there are a number of populations that are highly vulnerable. They are undergoing climate change already. They can see it coming. They have advisors from various places that tell them it's coming. And as things begin to unfold, either they look to change their environment or they look to move, depending on what resources they have available to them. Kwajalein Atoll Sustainability Laboratory, let's call it CASTLE, has the ability to go around the world looking for clever ideas and bring them into the Marshallese and test some of those ideas to see whether it would do something helpful in either the quality of life they have now or the capacity to move to somewhere else and be useful when they get there.
So what's it like there? I've looked at some of the pictures, but I want my listeners to kind of visualize what you are really at the far end of the world there when you're on location.
True. It's about 2,500 miles to the southwest of Hawaii, right in the middle of the Western Pacific Ocean. It is picture postcard beautiful. It is a lot of low-lying islands ringing a coral atoll, and the level of the land for these atolls is rarely more than 6 feet above the water, and in many cases quite a bit lower than that. It's palm trees and pandanus trees and breadfruit trees, and it is a couple of population centers that are crowded. The capital of the Marshall Islands on its own atoll in the relative south of the Marshall Islands is called Majuro. And that's crowded and strung along a single road, but is basically like many other places in the world. It's not exceptional in the sense of crowding or risk. However, the second population center up on Kwajalein Atoll, about 300 miles to the north-northwest, that has one population center called Ibai that has somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people living on an 80-acre sand spit open to the ocean on one side and lagoon on the other, and you can walk across the island in about 5 minutes.
Before we get into the specifics of the Picard event and such, tell me a little bit about your background. You have a very extensive background. You're one of these people that you'd probably spend 5 minutes reading your bio, but could you just quickly tell us this really interesting background that you have?
Sure. Grew up kind of poor in the deserts of Southern California, joined the Navy when I was 17, went into nuclear submarines, did fine there for 7 years, got out, went to Stanford undergraduate, Stanford Medical School, went back in the Navy, and spent a total of 25 years eventually as fleet surgeon for Third Department of Medicine at a large Navy medical center here in Seattle. Then over my retirement weekend, got hired by Google. And there had been a TED Prize that was awarded to the head of Google.org, a guy named Larry Brilliant, a wonderful human being. And he asked me to lead that TED Prize. So I did that for 3 years. I'm still chairman of that board, started my own company with my partner, Alex Hatum. And we've been at the introducing of the humanitarian sciences into all kinds of places in the world for about the last 13 years.
I want to ground my listeners because that background lends itself to what we're doing with the Picard thing. And why is the U.S. military thinking about climate adaptation?
The U.S. military is thinking about climate adaptation because back in 2007, the U.S. military published a study showing that climate change was going to be a matter of national security. It's a very fact-based organization with the responsibility for keeping America safe, and they look at threats of all kinds with a very open and fact-based eye and said, this is going to be a problem. So they recognize that we have hundreds of bases all over the world, and many of those bases sit within population centers or they sit within environments that are at risk. Either it is something that is a direct threat from climate change, or it's a direct threat to the people that have to move because of climate change. So the U.S. military has been interested in climate change and climate adaptation and the protecting of both its bases and the people within whom their base members live when they're outside the wire for 2 decades.
So in this episode, we're going to talk to people that attended the Picard event, and you were there at the center of it, the organizer. I don't know what you officially called yourself, but you were the master of ceremonies, and you recruited people. First off, tell us what Picard stands for, because this is going to be at the beginning of the episode, and tell us a little bit of the history of the event.
Sure. So about 6 years ago, several of us began working in the Marshall Islands on issues associated with climate change. Out of that came the idea of a hybrid institution. CASTLE, the Kwajalein Atoll Sustainability Laboratory, is a Marshallese NGO, non-governmental organization, but it has a research arm that is supported by the U.S. Office of Naval Research. ONR, Office of Naval Research, has been very interested in climate adaptation and has recently begun an entire section inside ONR devoted to this topic because they consider it important to national security. This hybrid institution, CASTLE, began collecting ideas for climate adaptation from around the world. And at one point, we had a list, last time I checked, was about 72, 74 ideas that somebody somewhere had. For example, MIT gave us 7 ideas that they wanted to test in this laboratory. So as we collected ideas and as we worked with the Marshallese to decide which ones were likely to be useful for populations as vulnerable as the Marshallese around the Pacific, we found that there were a number that were worth testing to a degree that we would eventually show them to people and get wider opinion. That's what Picard became. Picard is an acronym that stands for Pacific Island Climate Adaptation Research and Development. And that was a symposium that we held in Hawaii in early June.
And there is a relation to Captain Picard, right?
Long ago and far away, about a decade ago, the Roddenberry Foundation, which is a foundation that carries on the work of Gene Roddenberry, the founder of Star Trek, began supporting me and my business partner, Alex Hatum, who's a former Army intelligence officer, former Navy SEAL, who worked with the Navy SEALs. I should put it that way. He would be very careful about that. He was Army attached to the Navy SEALs for a long time. He and I began responding to disasters with the support of the Roddenberry Foundation. The Roddenberry Foundation kept supporting us as we deployed to Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, as we went to Haiti for Hurricane Matthew, to 3 deployments to Puerto Rico. And in the course of that, not only did we develop a fair amount of loyalty to the Roddenberry Foundation, but most of us were very fond of Star Trek to begin with.
Okay, I like that history there. All right, so tell us a bit. So this event happened. I was there. It was fantastic. Quite a diverse crowd. You can't tell us everyone who was there, but just give my listeners a sampling. Like, what kind of speakers were you recruiting and who was attending this?
Sure. So the speakers that we recruited for Picard included people who had come to us with some kind of idea because we wanted the actual inventors, the people who were in the creative process, to talk with the people who were going to be receiving that idea and testing it for themselves. That meant that we brought in people from Australia, we brought in people from South Korea, from the United States, from Chile, from the UK, and they all had something to offer across the 12 sectors that CASTLE looks at. And many of those sectors are exactly what you'd expect, right? They're the obvious things. It's how to clean water, how to establish food security, how to improve communication or transportation or education. But one of the things that is a particularly important sector that is almost unique at the moment to the Marshall Islands is cultural preservation. When I first made the list with the Marshallese of how we were going to approach work at Castle, I had put cultural preservation down at the bottom, just below ecosystem regeneration. And that got me a sharp rebuke from the Marshallese, who point out that absolutely everybody has issues of water purification and food security, communication, and education. But very few people are looking at having to lose everything they've had for 3,000 years, right? Their land is going to disappear within possibly the lifetime of a baby born today. That meant that we needed to look much more broadly toward tools that have rarely been tested in capturing the idea of a culture in all of its complexity. And we brought in people to help do that. And we brought in people with what's known as water generators, atmospheric water generators. We brought in people that knew something about growing food in trailers. We brought in people that were expert at desalination using solar power, because many of the islands in the Marshall Islands have very few people, and a solar-powered desal unit can keep people safe, and so forth and so on.
So you're talking about you're bringing people in too, and I want you specifically to mention that you had this whole session on demos, and people came up and they had 5 minutes, and it was almost like a startup pitch. And can you just elaborate on that? How did you decide on that? And there was quite a few of these.
Yeah, there were. We had about 25 of those lightning talks, and they were the standard format. Many of us have seen this for lots of years. About 6 minutes each, where you describe the problem, you describe your solution, you tell the impact that you're hoping for. We considered doing it only with 4 or 5 or 6. Then, as we recognized that we had a bunch of people in the room who had very different problem sets. So we had people from islands all over the Pacific Island nations. We had people from Australia and New Zealand and from Vietnam and elsewhere who had different kinds of problems. We thought it would be short-sighted to not give people some visibility into everything that we had available. So we decided to do lightning talks, a very old idea, and it went very well. We had 25, of which 20 were something like a thing. And several were related to educational curriculum. Occasionally, we had 1 or 2 that were specifically around scale. How do you take this clever idea that you might have and move it into something that would be both manufacturable at scale and affordable for the people who needed it?
So we're having this conversation post-Picard event. You have some follow-up with people that were attending. What's the feedback been? I think you said that there's been some conversations happening on the side, and those are the kind of things that you want after a conference.
That's exactly right. So yes, we had a fair amount of very pleasant feedback after we finished, but that's always nice, right? That most people feel pretty good at the end of an optimistic, and in fact, I wouldn't call it optimistic. Let's call it applied hope conference, when we are showing people that things may not be quite as dire as they seem. So immediately afterwards, we had a lot of positive feedback. But what really matters is whether the people who were exposed to those demos and are at risk now found anything valuable in the demonstrations and chose to follow up. And the answer is yes. Of the, let's call it 20 demonstrations we have, I know that at least 8 have moved into expansion mode, where if they had 1, they now have 2 or 3 or 4, or if they had 20 and were ready to scale, they were able to get into some discussions that will incubate them from where they are now into something much more robust and that will eventually be affordable for the Marshallese and other Pacific Islanders.
Following up on Picard, this is an ongoing thing, but I think the next event that's sort of a next phase of this is the Seaside event. And again, I want you to explain what that acronym stands for. But when's that happening? What's that supposed to do?
It's very nice to be on audio so that Seaside makes sense, because when you see it on the page, it's a little difficult. It is climate, security, innovation, and experimentation demonstration, CSIED. Seaside. We were very proud of that acronym, but I'm not sure we should be. So Seaside is a follow-on to Picard. Picard happened in a large hotel conference room. perfectly ordinary, right on Waikiki Beach in Honolulu, Hawaii. Seaside is entirely different. Seaside is going to take those demonstrations and others that we will find through the course of the year and move them onto Ibai Island. When we first started this conversation, I mentioned that Ibai on Kwajalein Atoll, where Castle is located, is a very small, very crowded sand spit, 80 acres, 10 to 12,000 people. Nobody's quite sure. And we are bringing what had been demonstrations out to an integrated demonstration where we are going to build a few scenarios over the course of a week on how we provide food and water and power and education, communications and healthcare and a few other things, and begin to try these demonstrations in the field under very rugged conditions with very few resources, mostly self-supported. And we're going to see how they do, because it's very easy to have a conversation in a Hawaii hotel room and talk about this cool thing that you have. It's quite another thing to fold that cool thing that you have into an ongoing, let's call it disaster scenario, although I think a couple of the scenarios are very slow onset disasters, like climate change, like sea level rise, like water desalination for the aquifers under Ibai, and out of that come out with something that either is robust enough to be of genuine help or isn't.
All right, Eric, interested in participating Picard. There's people that are doing coastal work, but they could learn some lessons here. And I think those demos have many applications outside of islands. What's next there? Could they participate? How do they kind of get in the loop on this?
Sure. So Castle has a website, and while we are not interested in people who simply want to come out and visit, although the Marshallese would probably love it, their tourism industry is not as robust as they would like it to be, and it is an absolutely stunningly beautiful place. Let me mention that you can go to Castle, KASL.earth, EARTH, castle.earth. Take a look at what we're doing. If you have something you think is worthwhile, fill out the application form that is on that website, and we'll talk.
Fantastic. Eric, you're doing amazing work there and lots of lessons to be learned. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure having the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Dr. Michael Langston. Michael is the Acting Deputy Program Manager, Resource Conservation and Resilience and Climate Resilience Program Areas at SERDP and ESTCP. Hi, Michael. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug, for having me. I'm excited.
Let's ground people. I've done an episode before on SERDP, and I'm using the acronym because it's easier. But for those people who didn't listen to that episode, what is SERDP? What is ESTCP?
SERDP stands for the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. ESTCP stands for Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. Don't ask me why we have one that we pronounce and one that we spell out. That's way above my pay grade. But these are the Department of Defense's research, development, test and evaluate investments in installation, resilience, restoration, and conservation.
And I just really briefly, because you are on detail, but you are actually based within the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And just for my listeners, I think these are really cool things. What do those things do?
The South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center is a part of the U.S. Geological Survey. And despite the fact that it has geological in the name of it, the USGS does all kinds of really cool science in all kinds of disciplines. And the South Central CAS funds research on climate adaptation. And they're located in Norman, Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma. That's where the office is. But they cover the region of New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. And for the past decade, I was the deputy director there. And this last October, I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to work with the good folks in the SERDP and ESTCP program office. I've been there since then, and they are talking about potentially extending that.
We last saw each other in Honolulu, Hawaii, which was fantastic. So why were you at the KHA and PCARD events?
Our program office funds research on both natural and cultural resources. The Department of Defense at their installations has an obligation to preserve culturally significant resources. We find that going to these kinds of events where the preservation of these cultural resources in the face of climate change helps us both to understand what the state of the science is, what are the newest, latest technology gizmos out there that we could invest funds in that might help our cultural resources managers at military installations. And second of all, it helps us connect with cultural resource managers so we understand better what their needs are. One of the worst things that a funding agency can do is fund research that is irrelevant to those who are managing the resources.
You're funding these programs, obviously cultural resources. You don't typically associate that with the military. Is there another example or like a case study of where you guys are funding a cultural resource project?
Yeah, an exciting one is a project that's looking at using aerial-based LiDAR to identify cultural resources on the ground. As I mentioned before, military installations have an obligation to try to preserve these cultural resources, and sometimes they're artifacts, like an old road or a foundation of a building or a campsite. And currently, the way we try to identify those is we send a bunch of archaeologists out in the field. They walk all over the field and check for things that look like a culturally significant site. But using aerial-based LiDAR, we can look at the topography, the slight changes in topography, maybe just a few inches might help identify the difference between an old field and an old road, or maybe wagon ruts, or maybe even an old foundation. And that can save a lot of money. If we can identify those using a drone or aircraft, we can cover hundreds of acres in a flight. Then we can have the archaeologists go out and look at very specific areas, saves a lot of time and a lot of money. So that's one of the projects that we're funding now. They're looking at aerial-based LiDAR for cultural resource identification.
There were the two events, the Keeping History Above Water, but then the Picard event. And so one was the one-day KEHA and then the two-day Picard. But any highlights, first off, with the KEHA event for you? Just you, top of your head kind of highlights from that event.
Just getting to hear the hearts of the people that are being affected by climate change was really impactful for me personally and professionally. The Marshallese Islands are sinking into the ocean as the sea level rises. Even before the sea covers those oceans, their drinking water will probably be completely saline and the islands will be uninhabitable. That's a really difficult situation. The military not only cares about our installations, our military installations, but they care about the communities around them. And so in a situation like this, the military feels a strong sense of we want to help the community as well as, of course, our installation. So that was really impactful for me.
Yeah, they were definitely the focus of even the Picard event. And I learned so much about those islands. And that'll be a big theme of this episode there. So that was really cool just to learn how they're planning on disappearing as a country. Very sobering kind of thing. So let's pivot to the Picard event. And that was a 2-day event. What stood out in that event?
The technology was really fascinating to me. There was nanotechnology, a thin nano-engineered film that can help cool packages or anything that you can put a sticky film on below ambient temperature using no electricity, no power whatsoever. I was fascinated by that. And then the other thing, of course, was Dr. Billy Berry's intelligence augmentation, which is something that really has potential. It's like AI, but he makes a clear distinction between it and AI. And I won't speak for him, but I think that is really worth further development.
Yeah, I got behind the scenes demo of that too. And I'm still trying to figure out what he's doing there, but it sounds like the applications will be tremendous. And yeah, it was cool seeing him put that up there. You were part of SERDP, and each year they do a symposium, and I covered the symposium in 2023, and that was such a fantastic event. You guys do this annually. Can you give us a little bit of a preview for that, a general time frame and what you guys expect to cover?
Yeah, we're really excited. The symposium is planned for December 3rd through the 6th. It is called the DoD Energy and Environment Innovation Symposium. It will be at the Washington Hilton Hotel, of course, in Washington, D.C. For those who would like more information, I suggest that they go to our website, which is SERDP-ESTCP.org. And there you can sign up for our mailing list. Of course, all the information will be emailed out in newsletters and other things. So you'll be the first to know once the registration is open. It's not open right now. One of the things we're going to highlight this year is innovative vehicles. So they are working hard to bring some vehicles military vehicles actually to the event. So show and tell there. We will also, of course, be highlighting all of our current projects and many of our past projects. Last year, we had over 1,500 attendees. So this is not an insignificant event. And anyone who's interested in adaptation will find some really interesting and innovative things that the Department of Defense is leading the way on. If they're interested, I highly suggest that they consider attending this year.
I'll have a link in my show notes so people can find that. And it was my understanding last year was the first year that resilience and adaptation basically got its own track. And so that's the plan again for this year too.
That is my understanding. Yes, we're still in the planning phases, so the agenda has not been set. And until it is, everything could change. But that is the plan right now. And I fully expect that's exactly how it will go down this year.
All right. Fantastic. Yeah, it was, I learned so much. It was crazy. The poster session was probably the best poster session I've ever been to in a conference. It's just the diversity of research that you guys fund. So that really exciting stuff going on out there.
We actually require that every one of our currently funded projects present a poster at this event. So we have lots of posters, so many that the posters are only up for one day out of the 4 days of the event. So we have to rotate through our posters so that we can get them all up for at least one day.
Yeah, I didn't know that. And I saw a project that I want to interview the person who had the poster. And then I went back the next night. I'm like, where is it? And so I was able to track the person down. But yeah, the volume is just amazing. All right, Michael, this has been fantastic. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. I'm back and I'm with the Honorable Senator Kitlan Kabua. Welcome to the podcast.
Yahweh, everyone. I'm very much happy to be part of this podcast and this interview. Komol.
This is an honor for me. I've never had anyone from the Marshall Islands. And so maybe you could just ground my listeners at first, just really a brief overview. The Marshall Islands, where you come from. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. The Marshall Islands is a low-lying atoll nation, one of 4 atoll nations in the world. It's a country that's nestled between Hawaii and Australia. It's 29 coral atolls and 5 islands, which makes up over 1,200 single islets. And on these many different islands, there are only 24 islands and atolls that are populated. And the population currently is a little over 39,000. And it's part of the North Pacific. Tropical and very flat, no mountains, but beautiful country.
I know a little bit about it, but when you were speaking, I was actually looking at Google Maps too, and I was looking at the maps of the country, and these are some narrow areas that you guys are living in. And obviously sea level rise plays a big part. And could you give us a brief overview on some of the comments? You gave a presentation at the Keeping History Above Water portion of this meeting. Can you tell us a bit about what you talked about?
I did. As you have stated, not a lot of people know where the Marshall Islands is and how unique the country is. So just to give you some background and context, when you combine the land area of the Marshall Islands, it is a little bit larger than Washington, D.C. However, if you look at the overall EEZ, exclusive economic zone, it is approximately the size of the Pacific Northwest. It spans over 800,000 square miles or 1.2 million square kilometers. So it's a large area of territory, and it is something that our ancestors had traversed the large Pacific Ocean. They didn't see it as something that separated us, but they saw it as something that combined us and something that gave us life. And for a Marshallese person, not only is the ocean important, but the land is important as well. The meagerly resource islands still do play a large part for us. So today, in modern terms, when we're facing the effects of climate change, namely coastal inundation, what we're seeing is more tidal events that are eroding away our islands, that are washing above our land and destroying our environment, our home, our assets, our culture, and ultimately our identity, just to name a few of the challenges that we face today.
Could you go into a little bit more specifics with that? Because KHA, the Keeping History Above Water Conference, is about cultural resources here. Tell us, what are some of those things in the Marshall Islands that you're trying to protect?
For the Marshallese, we didn't have a written language. It was an oral culture, and what is important and near and dear to us was passed down generation after generation through these means. And for a Marshallese, everything that makes you a Marshallese comes from your mother. Your land, your title, and your clan, they come from your mother because you cannot deny who it is that you come from. So back to the land, it is a land that nourishes the people. And the reason why our people were forced to become ACE open ocean navigators was so that they can easily travel to these islands to collect resources for survivability. So the keeping history above water and the way that it was first founded for the Newport, Rhode Island homeowners, and now it expanded to the Pacific to include the Pacific, it's a change of mind. Not only are you looking at the physical preservation of an asset, of your home. For us in the Marshalls, the whole land is our home. That's ours. So how do we adapt? How do we preserve these things that are connected to our land?
Maybe a lot of people don't know that we have military facilities in the Marshall Islands. And obviously there's a complex relationship with your people and the Department of Defense, but we're here. This is a Department of Defense hosted conference. Tell us a bit about that complex. It's a partnership, but at the same time, there's issues. Tell us a bit about that.
It's a complex, you say complex, but I say it's an intimate partnership with the U.S. government. The Marshall Islands and the U.S. government, we have entered into a Compact of Free Association, which was first ratified in 1986. This allows the U.S. to have access to our land, our ocean, our airspace for the sake of global security. And in exchange, there's monetary compensation, there's immigration benefits for both citizens, and there are partnerships and some of these things that are not given in both countries' engagements with other countries, bilateral engagements. There is a military base, a U.S. Army garrison that's located in the Kwajalein Atoll. The Kwajalein Atoll is the largest lagoon in the world. So to have it strategically placed there stems to the World War II era. The Marshall Islands and Kwajalein Atoll were instrumental in tipping the point for the U.S. in their success against Japanese forces. This is through Operation Flintlock, which I have come to learn was a successful mission for the U.S. military back during the World War II. And that is when our intimate partnership with the U.S. had truly commenced.
And there's also just even post-war, tell us a little bit about the nuclear weapon testing.
So post-World War II, we were under U.S. trusteeship. But a year before that, the U.S. had initiated their nuclear testing program, which was a 12-year program that detonated 67 known nuclear bombs in various locations in the Marshall Islands. This was during trust. Along with the Marshall Islands, there was the now Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, which today were dubbed as the Freely Associated States because we have entered into Compact of Free Association agreements with the United States. But from the nuclear testing program, there are a lot of devastating effects from that time. It has negative impact to our population today, whether we were present during the testing or not. As you understand, radiation, it causes intergenerational issues such as cancer, such as thyroid issues and other things. Our situation, our challenge looking at the effects of climate change to our islands and how it's wreaking havoc to our islands is compounded by things such as the nuclear legacy history.
Tell us a bit about the people there, though. It's not a large population. I would imagine just water's everywhere, the coastlines everywhere. Does your average person there think about climate change? Are they thinking about adapting to climate change? Because in the United States, not a lot of people are actually thinking about it. But what about there? Would the average person be talking about it?
Yes. When you live on a low-lying atoll nation, where the highest elevation is 7 feet, yes, you see the effects of it. I'm only little more than 3 decades old on this earth. And there are changes that I see today compared to when I was growing up. Places that I used to play on the beach are eroded away. The ferry that takes the people from Ebi to the garrison, the base on Kwajalein Island, back and forth, the boat the sea level, as you would observe it at the dock when I was growing up would be much lower. But today, it's as if the water is right at the dock level. Again, 3 decades worth of changes. So it is scary. Before, when you would ask a person who has decided to up and leave the Marshall Islands and come to the United States, because a lot of our people, they migrate here to the United States. They came here in search of better health opportunities because a lot of them are sick. We have a sick population, a population that is not at prime health levels due to various reasons, including nuclear legacy. They come to the United States for educational opportunities, job opportunities, and today, very recently, we've confirmed that people are migrating because their homes have been devastated by something that's linked to climate change. They can't rebuild their home after a king tide event. They cannot bear another drought season because they were living in the neighboring islands and the government was not deploying emergency relief on time. That's another added reason.
What are some takeaways from these 2 meetings for you? Any positive takeaways that you're going to go back?
It's always good to start with a positive. And actually from this conference, there is no negative. Eye-opening, yes. But the positive takeaways is that we truly need to hold each other's hands and see how we fight this together. It cannot be a siloed effort. We cannot say, okay, government of the Marshall Islands, you do you, and the U.S. government, you do you, private sector, you do you, government sector, you do you. It does not work that way. In Marshallese, we have a saying, and "Wore tipil" means together to pursue an effort. Together, we are stronger if we pursue an effort. And I think it's quite applicable right now, and to listen to all the presenters and just to see the overwhelming number of participants throughout these 2 conferences representing various areas, it shows that there are a lot of partners that are willing to join the effort. How do we make the connections? So I'm very grateful to the organizers, to the Department of Defense, to the Newport Restoration Foundation, as well as CASEL and partners that have organized the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation and Research Development Conference. It was a coming together of expertise and astounding people with astounding backgrounds to see what they are bringing to the table for the sake of connecting the dots.
Fantastic. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you. Modada.
Hey Adapters, joining me is Stanton Enomoto. Stanton is the current program director at the U.S. Department of Interior's Office of Native Hawaiian Relations. Hi Stanton, welcome to the podcast.
Aloha, Doug. Thanks for having me here.
So Stan, just giving people a little bit of background, we actually know each other from a previous life when I worked within the climate change response program in the National Park Service at DOI. So we have that in common. So I'm excited to get you on.
Yep, totally. Yeah. Happy to be here and happy to reconnect. It brings back the old days. Good to be here.
First off, tell us a bit about this Office of Native Hawaiian Relations. What do you do there?
Sure. The Office of Native Hawaiian Relations is housed within the Office of the Secretary, within the Department of the Interior. We're, for example, not attached to Fish and Wildlife Service or National Park Service, etc. We're based out of DC, but we have a larger office out here in Honolulu. But we're still a small office. There's 4 of us here in Hawaii, and we have 1 colleague in DC. But we look to implement the department's responsibilities to the Native Hawaiian community through the Hawaiian Homelands Trust. There was a law passed that set aside homesteading opportunities 100 years ago for Native Hawaiians out here in the islands, as well advancing self-determination, reconciliation, self-governance types of activities for our Native Hawaiian community with the United States. So it's a catch-all, but we're here to represent Native Hawaiian interests in DOI and to some extent across federal government.
What brought you to the Keeping History Above Water conference?
I was invited by the conference organizers, largely through the Department of Defense, and the whole Keeping History Above Water concept dealt with a lot of cultural resources, impacts of climate change on those resources and historic preservation, So this year's theme, or this conference's theme, dealt with Hawaii and the Pacific. I was asked to speak about and be a participant on climate change impacts related to cultural resources here in Hawaii and their impacts on our Native Hawaiian community.
What was interesting for me is that I thought I understood what cultural resources are, but being there in the Pacific, I learned that that could take many definitions. Maybe your own hat or working for DIY, but what qualifies as a culturally significant resource that might be impacted by climate change? And I know you can't go down the whole list, but it's just...
Sure. Yeah, that term cultural resource is just, it is so broad, right? But I think at least out here in the islands, the way our Native Hawaiian community looks at it, it's not just a particular place. We're islands out here, so place is incredibly important. And then obviously we have traditional Native Hawaiian sites, or elsewhere in the Pacific, there are traditional sites of which those communities attach themselves to. So it's place, it's site, and it's also the resources that exist within it, whether it's biological resources, whether it's terrestrial or marine. I think in a indigenous context, and I think it's shared across all indigenous cultures, there's this relationship that people have between place, between resources, and the environment in which we all coexist. And that makes up, I think, what we would define as cultural resources. So when we think about climate change impacts, it's completely cross-cutting through all of those things. So it made for a very interesting conversation at KHA.
All right. So bear with me. This is a question that I think, and I'm mining into the panel that you were on because I think it's very interesting, the things that you had to cover. So people have this idea of what historic preservation is, and they think his specific sites, but let's say you're in the Pacific region, and site preservation is not the whole cultural show. So climate change impacts rainfall, temperature, and other environmental factors, and these can impact agriculture, traditional practices, and these sorts of things. So what tangible and intangible elements should be a focus of action then? Do you do something specific at DOI, or did you learn other approaches while you were at KHA?
A lot of my experience comes back from when you and I worked together at National Park Service. And since then, this idea that it's all connected, at least in my mind, from an indigenous perspective, that yes, physical sites, historic properties as defined under National Historic Preservation Act, and we have buildings, we have sites, we have objects, it's very structured. So we have that, of which many Native Hawaiian traditional places fall within. But we also, to your point, have these intangible aspects about relationship, a family or an individual's relationship to place. And when that particular place, it may not have a historic site on it, but there is a familial connection, or in some respects, even a genealogical connection to that place. And that place is then impacted by climate change, whether it's wildfire, flooding, drought, or some other activity that creates an impact on that community, that population. And that's some of the things that I was wanting to raise during KHA. And I think for our Pacific Island communities, it really is an important topic, especially when, we get out into the smaller islands, the atolls of the Marshalls or elsewhere in Micronesia, where in a few decades, those islands may be underwater. That relationship is at risk. Those are some of the kind of questions that keep me awake at night and think about how we're going to adapt and what are some of those solutions that we can work on.
So big picture, how do you think we ensure indigenous practices are prioritized in our response to climate change? And I'm thinking our old colleague, Dr. Marcy Rockman, she was there doing cultural resources within the program. And it was always like a battle for her because NPS in a lot of ways, just between you and me, there's this natural resource focus to the Park Service. And how do you make sure, because at this KHA event, obviously cultural resources were the priority, but how do we ensure that?
It's a tricky one. I think when we start talking about cultural sites, cultural places, or places of importance to community from that kind of historic or cultural perspective, it really starts getting very localized, I think. And the community itself needs to embrace what it means that these places that mean something to us are at risk from climate change. And it could be progressive with sea level rise and coastal inundation on a seasonal basis, or it could be acute in the form of a wildfire that just destroys that area, just like what we experienced here in Hawaii a year ago, where the whole town or almost all of the whole town of Lahaina was incinerated by a wildfire in a matter of hours. And Lahaina is on the National Register as a landmark, as a historic landmark district, and it's not there anymore. All communities, I think, need to recognize what's at risk, what's at stake. We're all vulnerable. And then from there, start having these conversations about how do we preserve what's most important about these sites, whether it's architecture or whether it's oral history or whether it's records or some other thing, and start taking measures to preserve that, because we never know what's going to happen tomorrow. Some things we can foresee, but other things we can't. So it's better to be prepared than try to reconcile what happens afterwards. And that's in large part what's happening out here in Hawaii and Lahaina now, where the community is coming to terms about what's there and how do we preserve, enhance, grow what from the devastation that happened a year ago.
I don't know if this is official DOI kind of a statement here, but just you're representing one federal agency. And so you were invited to this KHA event. So what do you think of? It's not what you traditionally think of a DOD hosting a cultural resource and climate change adaptation event. So what are your thoughts?
I think it's great that across federal government, various departments, DOD, Department of Transportation, DOI, we're all understanding the effects of climate change. And I know there's a number of policy guidance documents coming out of the White House or directives down through all departments. So it's encouraging to see that other departments besides DOI are taking it to heart and looking at the effects of climate change on our respective areas and trying to act, whether it's around adaptation or whether it's around mitigation. We're all in this together. So it was very encouraging, and I was appreciative to DOD for inviting me to KHA.
Last question. You're there in Hawaii. Do you have a favorite spot there in Hawaii?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think just for myself, growing up on Maui and where my family has been for years and years, I would think the island of Kaho'olawe ranks up there as having very special meaning to me in a number of ways. But like the rest of the Hawaiian Islands, it's being impacted by climate change. So it's on the leeward side of our archipelago. So it's subject to drought. It's subject to wildfires. And of course, sea level rise is impacting all of our islands around the state. So these are the things that we try to be mindful of. But yeah, I have a special attachment to that island. And well, of course, Maui's home. So it'll always be there for me.
All right, Stanton, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a treat that we could reconnect at KHA.
Thank you very much, Doug. Happy to be here. And yeah, happy to be a part of America Adapts. So thanks.
Hey Adapters, joining me is Margaret Back. Margaret is the Preservation Projects Manager at the Newport Restoration Foundation. Hi Margaret, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Doug, thanks for having me.
What is the Newport Restoration Foundation and what do you do there as a Preservation Projects Manager?
Yeah, so the Newport Restoration Foundation is a nonprofit organization. We were established by philanthropist Doris Duke in 1968 to preserve the architectural and cultural heritage of colonial 18th and 19th century Newport. And really the primary tools and means that Doris Duke used to accomplish this was buying and restoring over 100 18th and 19th century vernacular homes across the city of Newport. Today, these properties are lived in, they're rented by our long-term tenant stewards, and they're maintained by our full-time preservation crew. In addition, we also steward the Rough Point Museum, Prescott Farm, and the Vernon House, as well as promote a year-round preservation trades training program. And at NRF, as a projects manager, I'm really involved in a variety of tasks, both hands-on with our buildings and overseeing and documenting some of the work of our crew in the field. And then, of course, I also have the privilege of working with our Keeping History Above Water program.
People are wondering about that. Give us a little bit of history about the Keeping History Above Water. And I just want to acknowledge, it's people who have been longtime listeners. I've done 2 previous episodes. I did one in St. Augustine. I did one in Trinidad and Tobago. But this all originated with you guys. Can you tell us a bit of the history of KHA there?
Certainly. So I mentioned a little bit about Newport Restoration Foundation, but what's really significant about our properties here in Newport is that about over half of them are located within the flood zone, or they will be within the flood zone with an additional 3 to 5 feet of sea level rise. So we recognize that our properties really are a handful of historic homes in the country at risk to sea level rise, but in one of the oldest and really most intact colonial neighborhoods in the country. We've always recognized that the choices that NRF makes with its portfolio can influence and really impact our neighbors and larger neighborhoods. Keeping History Above Water was founded in 2016 by the Newport Restoration Foundation, really to provide a forum for conversation around the effects of climate change and sea level rise to historic coastal communities and buildings. Really, we founded it both to help solve our own problems that we had, but still are facing about how to steward our portfolio of historic properties in the flood zone, but also to spark a larger conversation. We recognize that you can't solve sea level rise and climate change problems in a vacuum. You need to bring a lot of voices to the table to solve this issue. So I can talk a little bit about the first conference in 2016, if you like.
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, so the first one was really around a certain property of our 74 Bridge Street, which folks who've attended the first KHA in 2016 or even the second one in 2017 in Annapolis may recognize 74 Bridge Street. It's a corner lot. And it was a property that we previously owned that was flooding on a pretty regular basis. And we use that as our case study for different solutions that engineers, architects, preservationists, and planners could use to talk about this issue of sea level rise and how it affects historic communities. In Newport in 2016, it was really a multi-day conversation. It included an exhibit and a publication. What really came out of that couple of days was a lot of momentum. We just felt that we could continue on this conversation in other cities and other communities. And since 2016, we've had really just constant interest from other communities to host KHA events. So the momentum just hasn't really died since then.
Speaking of that, like I said, I've covered it in very unusual places. And then the Department of Defense expressed interest, and we both ended up in Hawaii because of that interest. And on that note, you tell us a bit about your role there. You were the Masters of Ceremonies, but can you give us some of your own highlights from that KHA event?
Yeah, absolutely. I really see myself, certainly NRF was a co-host that day with the Department of Defense, but I really saw my role there as an attendee. I was learning a lot about the Pacific Islands, coming from Newport, Rhode Island. I had a lot to learn. And I think one of the main roles you can do when you're attending these conferences is just to listen, to see how different stories connect back to your own neighborhood that you're coming from, and to try to make connections about how solutions in one part of the world could maybe benefit your part of the world as well. I really feel that I was mostly there as an attendee more than anything else, and to have conversations with folks, to talk about Newport, to talk about their neck of the woods, and to try to find some common solutions. I enjoyed the whole day. I really enjoyed the mix of attendees at this conference. It was different than past KHA events, I think in a really good way. We had our same diverse mix of government and nonprofit. We always have some academic and university folks and, of course, civilians or community members. But what I really enjoyed about this workshop in particular was that there were a lot more land use practitioners in the audience, as well as community organizations, folks whose central focus was not architectural preservation. A lot of past KHA conferences have been much more architectural heritage based. We've primarily had conferences based on the East Coast, so I think that lends to itself. But I really thought that the conversations at this workshop led to more place-based conversations because of the different folks who were in the room versus KHA events in the past.
So you do historic preservation there, but what did you think? Because we heard a lot about the Marshall Islands, and you think about their cultural history, and like you said, you guys typically focus more on architectural things, but what really stood out there? Here's an island that could potentially disappear. What are the implications for cultural preservation and all that? It was fascinating.
Yeah. One of my favorite speakers actually was Solin, her session, because I think what really stood out was that the conversation quickly went to how we're going to mitigate the potential loss of land, cultural landscapes, intangible heritage, and her session about protecting not only the physical heritage of a library space, the books and photographs and objects that are within, but also how she was working to capture stories and language through oral history documentation. That really stood out to me because once a place is no longer there, we have to start thinking about what's important for us to document and to record, and when should we start doing that and how should we start doing it. And I think in traditional preservation lens, we look at that in a pretty standard way. But when we're starting to think about it from a community perspective, what do you want to record? What do you want to protect? I really liked Solin's perspective on that beyond oral histories. And once the physical library is gone, what will you have?
This was coupled with the Picard event, and you were there, I think, for most of that very different event. Any takeaways that you'll take back to what you do?
Yeah, I think Picard opened my eyes. I really enjoyed the demos and the emerging technologies that were highlighted at their workshop. I really liked that they had a focus on accessibility to both Marshallese and other Pacific Islanders who were able to attend, having that live stream. I think they made it really accessible for people to tune in. I think it was a good bookend for the KHA event because we were really trying to focus on the cultural heritage, the intangible heritage, and they were really thinking more about what can we do immediately? What are these technologies to actually save people's homes today and to make it a livable, safe space for as long as possible? So certainly very different, but I liked how the two work together.
What's next for the foundation and KHA? What are you planning?
We're planning to continue conferences and events in the future. We're working right now on our 2025 event. I wish I could say what our host city is yet. We haven't quite narrowed that down. We're also really excited at the opportunity of coming back to the Pacific in the future, whether that's in Honolulu or another host community, and bringing these conversations full circle again.
All right. If people want to learn more about the foundation, what do you recommend?
You can follow our Instagram, Newport Restoration, and our website is newportrestoration.org.
All right, Margaret, thanks for coming on the podcast. It was nice meeting you in person in Hawaii.
You too, Doug. Thanks so much.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Kevin Chang. Kevin is the executive director of a community-based network backbone organization. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the podcast.
Aloha, Doug. Thanks for having me.
First off, I just gave a generic name of your organization. Could you tell us what the official name of the org is?
The name of my organization is Kuaʻāina Ulu ʻAuamo, which means grassroots, growing through shared responsibility. But you can call us Kua. Our acronym means backbone in itself.
All right. Well, that's a beautiful name, but I don't think I was going to do it justice. And all right, give us a broad view. What does your organization do?
Our organization was founded by rural Native Hawaiian communities who created a network to tackle the environmental issues of their places, starting with the fisheries. And our role really is to serve as a mechanism to support and gather community stewardship networks to share experiences, but also find common ground to affect policy and change the culture and context to make their work much more easier.
One of the things that we talked about at this Keeping History Above Water conference is about resilience and climate change resilience, but your organization helps build community resilience. How is that important in the context of climate change?
I think community resilience, we use this term first responders communities are their first responders for the issues that hit them. And especially as weather patterns change and things like the fires in Lahaina happen, we cannot expect government to be the first responder in the beginning. Quite often, communities have to. And the more resilient, the more close, the more familiar and understanding they are of and with each other, I think the stronger their ability to respond to natural disasters and things like that.
Does your organization cover all the islands in Hawaii, or is it just specific islands?
We have members in our networks. We have 3 networks. Those members touch on over 70 regions across 6 islands in our state.
And can you tell us a bit about the partnerships? Because you're there working with these communities, but obviously you're partnering with a lot of external groups. Give us some examples of that.
Well, if you just looked at the beginning of our networks, the founders of what became Kua had pushed to increase their ability to manage their own fisheries. And so really it grew from a desire for communities to have more say and more actual collaborative relationships with our government to make their places more abundant and healthy. Hawaii is the most isolated island in the world. And if things really got bad, all we have is ourselves.
In a previous conversation, you'd mentioned that at this World Conservation Congress in 2016, and these are these huge events, Hawaii was considered ahead of the curve for a lot of the groups there. What did you mean by that?
We don't often see ourselves as leaders or ahead of the curve, but this conference brought people from all over the world here, and the people who came told us and reinforced with us that actually, in a lot of ways, we are culturally and politically ahead of the curve in terms of building community capacity, changing the culture around what conservation means to us, and responding to our, and I wouldn't call it awakening, but an understanding of our kind of interdependence on the rest of the world and nature itself.
At the KEHA event, you were on a panel, and the panel was Citizen Climate Literacy and Communication in the Pacific. What messages did you share with the attendees there?
I think the main thing I wanted to say is that activating our community's awareness and ability and desire to care for their place and care for each other is really where we have to start, because a lot of, I think, building community resilience is not a top-down process. It has to start from the bottom and build up the capacity so citizens are both self-governing and humble and willing enough to work with government itself.
And because it's still somewhat new for a lot of organizations, how does climate change come up with your group? Is there an organic process on how people are educating themselves? I'm just curious how it blends into what you're already doing.
I think climate change affects us in many ways, we don't even totally understand yet. But just as an example, a lot of our work has to do with taking care of our shorelines. And so issues like acidification, reef impacts, rising tides, those all affect what communities do, because these guys are fishers, they're holders of indigenous knowledge, using and continuing practices around things like gathering seaweed, building traditional aqua facilities and things like that. And those are all affected by kind of the major climate issues we talk about today around things like sea level rise and stuff like that.
Any other observations from the KEHA event? Anybody that kind of stood out, people you were meeting and such?
I was inspired by the community members from Micronesia who spoke, because part of their healing and our government's ability to help and support them really is bound up in their historical experience as a community that has been bombed. Not only are they coming back from a history of nuclear testing, but now their islands are sinking. And I'm just surprised by the positivity they bring to that work.
Yeah, it was surprising that their nation's literally going to disappear, but they still want to roll up their sleeves. So that was inspiring. So what's next for you and your organization?
We're always involved, and we gather our people. We try to find emerging common themes, and we bring them together both to build a spirit of governance, but actually to do practical work on the land. We recently gathered a group of local ia or fish pond practitioners in the island of Maui, statewide though, and they talked about governance, but also they laid out over 1,000 linear feet of rock wall, about 3,000 cubic feet of rock in a reserve area that same day our Supreme Court ruled that our state needs to bring the waters back to that area. And so we're just one player in what I think is a grander effort to restore the kind of health and the way we used to better live with our environment. And that continues with us through policy, through bringing communities together to act and work, but to connect those efforts to the larger changes in our state, in the nation, and the world.
Fantastic. Last question, and you will have a unique perspective on this. What is your favorite spot in the Hawaiian Islands?
I could just say the Hawaiian Islands, but go ahead.
It must be a little small spot that you just find extra special.
I'm from an area called Kahalu on the windward side of Oahu. And I live in an area where if you could leave your head down on the ground and just go shopping, or if you stopped and just looked behind you from the parking lot, you probably see the most beautiful mountain range you have ever seen. And the older I get, the less I take that for granted.
Fantastic. Kevin, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Doug. Mahalo.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Karleen Sudol. Karleen is AAAS Science, Technology, and Policy Fellow with the U.S. Department of Defense. Hi, Karleen. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks so much for having me.
First off, tell my listeners, I used to deal with them all the time, but what is a AAAS Fellow?
We are the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences. So AAAS Fellows are sponsored by the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences, and they put mid-career scientists in federal agencies to help out with informing policy with science. So we get the opportunity to help DoD or Department of State or Department of Commerce, NOAA, NASA, NIH, all kinds of great agencies.
How long have you been there? And you're detailed actually, and I don't know if you use the word detailed, but you're at US DoD, but you're actually with the US Army, right?
Yes. So I am assigned to the Army Climate Directorate, helping out the Army, and ACD is in charge of overseeing the Army climate strategy and implementing it. The three main lines of effort are to make installations more resilient and adapt to climate change, and making logistics and acquisition more resilient, and also fostering climate literacy so that personnel know what is relevant for their position in terms of changing operating conditions.
I know we can't go into too much detail, but there is this Army climate strategy. Can you give us that 30,000 foot level? You talked about those pieces there, but what does that really look like on the ground? What's keeping you busy with it?
Definitely helping the personnel and our planners to get a handle on the extent of adaptation that we're going to need to do and what's important for their particular specialty. So DoD's set up a climate portal, climate.mil, to allow personnel to access up-to-date, DoD vetted, scientifically accurate information for their region or their specialty that will help them be more resilient. So areas that are facing increased wildfire risks, for example, may need to change the way they're managing their lands to protect against that. Areas facing severe flooding risks that they've never historically seen before, like West Point faced last year. We're trying to get that information out to the people in the field so that they can use it to stay safe and to continue their operations.
That's great. The U.S. Army is doing those things. Why were you at this KHA event? And you had a role there, but why were that important for you to attend this? Because it was cultural resources, it was climate change.
Yes, the KHA event was for cultural resource preservation, and that is a huge issue for the Pacific Island nations because they're very imminently facing climate threats of wave overwash and sea level rise. And a lot of these resources are difficult for them to necessarily move and secure. So we're exploring other options for maintaining cultural resources. And my office, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installation, Energy, and Environment, sponsored a parallel conference, the Picard Conference. That was Pacific Island Climate Adaptation, Research, and Development. And we focus more on technology that is off the shelf, ready to go to deploy in Pacific Island nations, coastal communities, anywhere really in the world to help with climate resilience and adaptation.
You had an opportunity to actually go to the Marshall Islands, and they were a major theme for both events. And can you just, again, we could do a whole episode on this, but can you tell us what it was like there on the ground and some of these issues that they're grappling with and why it's so important for the U.S. Army and you going there in the first place?
Kwajalein Atoll is an amazing place. It is the largest atoll on the planet. And the reason the Army is involved heavily there is that we have an Army garrison on Kwajalein Atoll. And I was able to accompany a senior leader out to do site visits to the garrison, and we looked at infrastructure. It's one of the most corrosive environments on the planet. So infrastructure is really challenged there. Housing is difficult to maintain. Aircraft are difficult to maintain. And the facilities themselves need upgrading. So we were taking a look at that and also looking at how we're going to have to adapt that installation in terms of sea level rise and especially wave overwash events. We just had a pretty significant wave overwash in January this past year that took us offline for a few days, and we're very lucky nobody was seriously injured, but those events are going to become more frequent. So we're looking at ways to mitigate the force of waves that may be overwashing the islands. And we're also looking at ways to make sure that we can maintain fresh water, because as the sea level rises, the aquifers are being infiltrated with salt water. So fresh water will be a challenge in the future.
I've just seen Google images of these islands. I can't even believe they have freshwater aquifers. They seem so small. You seem like you have to have some sort of base of terrestrial land. And we saw some footage of actual people from the Marshall Islands and those overwash events. I think a couple of them, basically the wave event crossed the entire island because these islands are not wide. Now, did that happen at the U.S. military facilities? Because I'm trying to visualize like all these things could happen, but did it overwash the entire base?
It did not overwash the garrison on Kwajalein, but there are garrison support activities that happen on ʻAuamo, and that area was overwashed along with one of the other smaller islands next to ʻAuamo, which they call Third Island. It's also known as Enomoto. So the orientation of those particular parts of the atoll were such that the wave overwash went across the entire thing.
It's such a different experience. I'm from Florida. When you have hurricane events, you can have the water come up way inland, but then it eventually goes right back out. Here we have these small islands, and it overwashes and goes out the other side. And it's just, seeing some of the imagery from the island is just quite shocking.
It really is. And then what's left sort of pools and depressions and has to be dealt with any other flood. So it's a lot of work recovering from these things.
Going back to the Picard event, give me some impressions. What really stood out for you? And you also gave one of these demos, and I'm covering the demos in this episode. And tell us briefly what you covered in your demo.
Oh, definitely. It was great. The demos, the speed talks were the best part, in my opinion. Although meeting the different Pacific Island nation representatives was huge, of course. And the best thing I think about the structure of Picard was that it was very much a shared discussion on adaptation priorities. And it was soliciting input from everyone about how adaptation looks for their nation and how they would like to see that unfold for their people. So that was huge to get that input and to be able to take that into account when we're making decisions on the DoD side. In terms of the speed talks, the speed talk that I gave was looking at a reef resilience adaptation called facilitated deep water upwelling. And this is something that is done, it's well established in the scientific literature, and it's been done successfully many places in the world. The particular protocol we're looking at is one done by the Climate Foundation, and they've developed it off the coast of the Philippines right now. They're upwelling colder, deeper water to the surface, and that does several things. It cools the surface temperatures enough that it can protect parts of the reef from bleaching. It gives it just that 1 to 2 degree temperature refuge that allows it to survive the bleaching events. And also that cold water has nutrients in it, and upwelling those nutrients increases primary productivity. So either it will allow phytoplankton to bloom, which provides more food for fish, or to even capitalize on that nutrient upwelling more, you can culture macroalgae. And the Marshallese community on Kwajalein has expressed interest in culturing macroalgae for not only food sustainment, but also for economic development. So we're hoping to pilot a macroalgal facilitated deep water upwelling array out near Kwajalein to try this out and hopefully preserve parts of the reef from the bleaching that's ongoing, and also to help with food sustainability, because that's really an issue because as the reefs bleach, of course, there's impacts to fisheries and food. So food and water sustainment is going to be an issue, unfortunately, closer in the future than we would like to think for some of these areas.
Yeah, those demos were fantastic. What a diverse set of, I can't even go into them all, but they were really cool. Some wide variety of things. And a lot of them were supposed to have their applicability within the islands and the Pacific Islands. And so, yeah, it was a big learning experience for me. Karleen, that's great. You're doing some fantastic work. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Patrick Lujan. Patrick is the Guam State Historic Preservation Officer. Hi, Patrick. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, how's your day?
We met at the Picard event and the Keeping History Above Water event. But first off, ground my listeners. Tell me a bit about Guam. I guess that 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, we're a little island out in the Pacific, probably just due south of Japan. We've been under colonial rule since 1521 with the Spanish and then the Americans and then the Japanese in the World War II and then back under American rule. And here we are over 500 years. And we still, as an indigenous people, the Chamorro people, that also expands up to the Mariana Islands. Guam is the biggest one. And yeah, it's paradise out here.
And what's the population of Guam?
Right now, probably, I'd say a little bit under 200,000.
Okay, that's still quite a few people for an island. What do you do there as the State Historic Preservation Officer?
So it's the government entity, local government, but in partnership and with some support with the National Park Service under the whole SHPO realm that every state and territory has, just to be the guardians of all the development and land, not only land development, but also any type of projects that go along. And going back to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, I believe, federal act, and mirrored through different variations from a local government standpoint. So we pretty much oversee all the development and looking at it from an archaeological, anthropological standpoint.
What would be some of the cultural resources that you have on Guam? I'm trying to visualize that, to describe what you kind of deal with there.
Yeah, so looking at different eras of history, I think what the main focus has been for the last generation is probably the ancient Chamorro history. Not much from a terrestrial that remains after so many wars, but whatever terrestrial remains, in particular the Latte stones, which is very significant and special to the Chamorro people, really respect those types of structures and it's a symbol of strength and foundation because those were the pillars of our ancient people's homes. And that era, and then going into subsurface archaeology, learning our history, because from a written standpoint, Guam and the Mariana Islands, our history has really been written by the Spanish. And of course, that's one side of the story. Any type of archaeology that's found that can give us some sense of reality from our ancestors has been really the focus of what we've been doing over the last generation. Obviously, there's also the Spanish era that we study, the first American era, and then with World War II being of such a global importance, that has been extensively studied, not only from a local standpoint, but from the National Park Service as well, with the investment in that. And as a matter of fact, just a couple of days ago, we celebrated the 80th year of the United States, somewhat what they call Liberation Day, when they came back to take over from the Japanese and the atrocities of that. Just right now, 80 years ago, my mother was a little child, 7 years old at that time. She's still alive, just to reminisce and just all of the things that war had brought into this little island. And not only on Guam, but throughout the Pacific, on the other islands as well. But just over 3,000 Americans and Chamorros died. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers died. That's just on Guam alone. So that's a significant, even though it was just like 2.5 to 3 years of our history, it's such a significant portion. And then, of course, the recovery and then the westernized, Americanized era, which we are in now. And what we have to do now is really look at more modern day history, so to speak, because within the NPS guidelines, 50 years is considered historic. And who would have thought that 1974 is a historic, significance being 50 years ago.
Can you tell me how climate change is playing a role in the work that you do? And I guess sea level rise is the major impact that you have to think about, right?
being an island, the beach is an attraction. And for centuries, the beach really has been our lifeline, right? And before we had any type of products that were imported, fishing is in our blood. And that goes to say for many Pacific Islanders, that was our sustenance, right? Is the fishing up to now. And with the climate change issue, knowing how our brothers and sisters in the Marshall Islands and dealing with it with the atolls, that is real life, no kidding, today issues. Other islands such as Guam and maybe even Hawaii and other Pacific Islands, we're seeing it, but not as drastic as Marshall Islands, right? Because we have some areas of elevation but one of those out of sight, out of mind, right? It's only the people that are living on the coastlines that have to worry about it. In the sense of climate change, we've seen the different impacts already on Guam. We've seen severe storms. We had one major one just last spring that just hovered for 12 hours, and that's just unlike any storm. The sea rise, the elevation, we see it here. And what do we do? And so I think the last conference and getting the islands together, getting some experts from NOAA, from the Pentagon, DOD, and starting to make this discussion more of a higher importance than it ever has been. And some of us have some time to do some adequate planning, and that was discussed in the conference. And some of us really don't, like the Marshall Islands. They're living through it, and it's really a topic. Actually, right here, we met on the topic just yesterday with the Joint Region Marianas folks. They've invested in having some people full-time positions just to plan for climate change and the impact it has on not only the military bases on island, but also they've hired local people to do this job. And of course, having that mindset that it's going to be not just the military bases and the impact it has, but also on the civilian population.
You are at the Keeping History Above Water event. Tell us a little bit your thoughts about that. What stood out for you?
I think what stood out the most is it was a wide range of stakeholders, whether it was from cultural resources, environmental resources, even FEMA was there as emergency planners. And I think for me, at least, was pretty much a really good launch into the Pacific Islands and making connections with the federal government and with people in DC and getting a clear picture of the realities of the Pacific Islands and the impact of climate change, and really getting a sense of what every island, the reality is, and the current conditions and probabilities. And I think that's key. And as I say, most of us have a little bit of time to plan accordingly. And I think a lot of good discussion was made as to what we can do from a cultural resource standpoint to keep our history alive, whether or not we're in the event we do go underwater, so to speak. And what can we do now to save that and preserve it for our future generations, even if we unfortunately do go underwater because of climate change?
All right, question for you. Do you have a favorite spot on the island of Guam?
Yeah, the southern part. It's the most untouched area of the island, and you see the most beautiful sunsets. I hate to say it, but Guam has the best sunsets in the world. Yeah, it's magical, and you have to see it to experience it. And so the southern island of Guam is really something special and something to really feel.
All right, Patrick, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Awesome, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Jeff Williams. Jeff is the Chief Scientific Officer of MedeSol Global, partner company to InnoFocus. Hi, Jeff. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Doug.
We're here to talk about some new technology that you're involved in. But first off, can you just really quickly explain to my listeners who you are?
Yeah, I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of MedeSol Global. It's a Bellevue, Washington-based company, and we have a portfolio of largely chemistry technologies that we've developed and some patented over the years. And we've partnered with InnoFocus in Melbourne, partly because the chief executive officer there, Frank Yao, is an investor in MedeSol, and we found it's worthwhile our cross-licensing technologies. Frank is a photonics physicist, very creative inventor, and we have some very inventive and innovative chemistries. So there's a nice kind of cross-fertilization going on between InnoFocus and MedeSol Global.
Frank Yao, who you just mentioned, he actually did the presentation at the Picard event, but you're here on his behalf, even though both of you were there. So this presentation that Frank gave had a lot of buzz at the Picard event, and you're going to explain it in more detail, but this radiative cooling film, and I think nanotechnology is involved, it just really wowed a lot of people there. And so I know we can't go into all the details there, but just very broadly, what is it?
Frank comes from the computer industry, from the telecom industry, with a background in particularly cheap chip manufacturing. And that has trended towards using nano manufacturing procedures. And he became quite expert in the technologies involved in nano-level manipulations of lasers. Manipulating lasers at the nanometer level is a very useful and potentially highly productive piece of the technology that affects computers, chip manufacturing. Frank had the concept of using lasers to modify surfaces, to manipulate them at nano levels so he could create surfaces that are entirely novel, new architectures of surfaces at nano level. And that's what he's exploited in developing these surfaces that can be both passively cooling and passively heating, simply dependent on environmental exposure to light. That's the breakthrough that he has.
Why I have you on and describing this is that we see this as a key adaptation technology. And let's dig into that a little bit more. So that I guess the cooling potential, because this whole event was about Pacific Islanders and this thing, and I'm curious too, it talks about being a cooling device, but is it cooling something or is it just deflecting heat? I wasn't quite sure how that worked. You look at the PowerPoint that he gave and it just deflected so much of the heat.
Yeah, the passive cooling is a really old concept, actually. It goes back several thousand years. And that is that if you can create a surface that reflects all the incoming solar energy, then what you allow is for the normal heat loss of the Earth and every surface on Earth to go back out into space. If you deflect all the incoming energy, there is a net heat loss. And that passive radiative cooling comes about without any energy input so that you can cool whatever is underneath the film passively. And the particular configuration that Frank's come up with is a film, actually several different films. But if you drape them over a surface, you allow for the reflection of all solar incoming energy and the efflux of that surface's infrared energy. And that cools it. Whether you drape that cooling film over a car and cool the inside of the car or a piece of clothing, or as we're finding very usefully, batteries, for example, that need to be cooled, that have an optimum temperature, simply coating them in a film that's exposed to sunlight will cool them. And the cooling effect can be quite profound, up to 10 degrees Celsius below the film.
Okay, that's fantastic. And so I'm in Tucson, and I was instantly thinking of different applications I could see for this. But you just described how it could be applied, but could you even go further? So we're focusing on the Pacific Islands. And so what would be some of the potential applications there? And that's what he shared in this presentation. But how could these island communities take advantage of this?
Well, heat is a very debilitating component of life in those Pacific Islands. And to be able to consider, for example, even a residence having a surface on the roof that cools the inside, facilities, hospitals, clinics that can be cooled passively by that relentless solar sunshine. That's one of the examples that we had. Preservation. We can wrap, for example, packaging. And Frank's done quite a bit of work in Australia with packaging of perishable foodstuffs, marine products, right? Finfish, shellfish. You can package them, wrap them in the film, and cool the inside of that packaging by 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, purely by the exposure to daylight. And those are some of the things that we thought about. Preserving medicines. It's hard to do that in Pacific Islands, keeping the temperature optimum for the preservation of heat-sensitive vaccines. That was another application that we had in mind. And we found a very ready audience there, recognizing that there are many circumstances where cooling something passively could be a big advantage to their livelihoods and their well-beings on Pacific Islands.
The presentation, obviously, we were at this climate change event, the Picard event. I'm curious, though, I think you guys are these early days. It's out there, it's being used. But do you guys use climate change and adapting to climate change as part of your market pitch? Is that a core part of it, or is it not necessary at this stage?
Oh, it certainly is, Doug. I think energy conservation, obviously, is one of the keys to adaptation to what's coming down the pike. And to be able to create cooling and heating passively without the kinds of costs that are involved, which are obviously some places really prohibitive at this point. But to be able to cool and to heat purely based on photons, photonic energy from light, that's, we think, almost revolutionary. And we think we have a lot to contribute to adaptations to climate change and the costs of energy that are involved.
But it would have those kind of dual purposes, the mitigation carbon side, but then on the adaptation side, because obviously I cover extreme heat a lot on this podcast and just the need to cool a lot of things down. That's what it's going for.
That's right. And now there are lots of other sort of corollary applications. We're looking at the potential for cooling data centers, for example, which are going to be an important part of everything to do with adaptation in the future. Those depend on cooling, and it's a very costly part of data center management. And just to be able to contribute passively with a film coating facilities, batteries, I think can be a very important part of that adaptation process.
You were at the Picard event yourself. Can you give this some thoughts, some highlights? What do you think?
Oh, what I enjoyed most was the technology presentations. I thought the creativity that was on display there, everything from containerized horticulture to, in our case, desalination, and there were several other technologies related to desal, and the possibility of creating potable water passively was very exciting. So I enjoyed it thoroughly. And I think we saw on that display a lot of ways that are relevant to the challenges, in particular of Pacific Islands, where there are lots of climate change impacts that are going to really be very serious in the future. And I think being able to contribute to that in the ways that we described was pretty exciting.
If people want to learn more about what you're doing here, you and Frank, what you're doing with this technology, what do you recommend?
We have helpful materials, and Frank displays some of those and has done quite a bit of presentations to various technology groups in Australia, principally. I encouraged him to think about the Picard conference because I knew that some of the things he had done and was talking about were relevant to the issues that are facing the Marshall Islands and other Pacific Islands too. So we're both very available. Some medical issues he's dealing with right now, and that's why he's not on this call. So I stepped in on his behalf, but he'll be back in the saddle. I'm available here on Pacific time to deal with what we want to think of, which is the development of Frank's technology and distribution here in the Americas. We're looking for potential partners to take some of these technologies into applications that make a lot of sense given what we're facing in terms of climate adaptation.
Jeff, I will have links in my show notes that people can pursue, but thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
I've enjoyed every moment, Doug, and I look forward to the possibility of communicating with some of the people who have heard our story today or heard it in the Picard conference in Honolulu.
Hey, Adapters, joining me is Dr. Alize Carrere. Alize is a National Geographic explorer, filmmaker, and she's researching and documenting adaptation to environmental change. Hi, Alize. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be here.
All right, you've been on before, but I'm going to ask you about that a little bit later. But ground us. Who are you? You're doing research. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, I actually just recently finished my PhD. So I was at the University of Miami doing a PhD in ecosystem science and policy. And my research focused on the rise of climate adaptive, climate responsive architecture and urban planning for the future. And I was looking specifically at how concepts of utopia and climate futurism are figuring into the agendas of policymakers, but then also, architects and planners and people who are actually in coming up with these creative visions for our future for the built environment. But I also, on the side, I do a lot of filmmaking, and I'm currently working on a second season of the adaptation series, which is what I was on your podcast to talk about a couple years ago. And that's a multi-part digital series for PBS that looks at how communities around the world are adapting innovatively and, sort of creatively to climate hazard.
So who were you working with there at the University of Miami?
Yeah, I was working with Dr. Katie Mock, who I believe you've had on your podcast before, maybe even more than once, and Dr. Kenny Broad. Those were my two committee chairs and collaborators now as I continue to take this work out into the world.
I saw you in Hawaii. What brought you to the Keeping History Above Water and the Picard event? What got you there?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to give you some credit because it was through conversations with you that I learned about Picard and the Keeping History Above Water conferences. And I had been looking for locations for the second season of the adaptation series that we're going to be doing for PBS. And I had definitely had interest in doing an episode on adaptation in Hawaii. And then out of this Picard conference was also able to think about what episode in the Marshall Islands would look like. And that was a really interesting and cool result of being a part of these two conferences in Honolulu.
Let's talk about the KHA event. Tell me some highlights there. What stood out?
Yeah, so I really appreciated hearing first and foremost from the Honorable Senator Kitlan Kabua, the senator from Kwajalein Atoll in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I thought she gave a really fantastic introduction to what a place like the Marshall Islands is going through right now around conversations of managed retreat. I actually found it pretty profound to hear a narrative that slightly pushed back, or in fact, not even slightly, significantly pushed back on the idea of managed retreat and saying like, hey, our number one principle in our national adaptation plan of the Republic of the Marshall Islands is the right to remain. And what would that look like for us as people who did not necessarily contribute to this global crisis that we are now, facing the impacts of? And so I found that to be a pretty powerful opening plenary session to hear from Senator Kabua and just, get that perspective. I think it's not a common one that we hear around managed retreat, and what people say, at the end of the day, we don't want to have to leave and just go make a new life elsewhere. There's an incredible amount of culture and history here on these islands that we've called home for generations. Another aspect of the conference that I really enjoyed was hearing from Jonathan Kukea Schultz. He's the executive director of Kaku'u Oi'i. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but looking at nature-based solutions for climate resilience and adaptation, and specifically the restoration of some of the low-ecolo wetland agriculture and fish ponds.
And so to your point about the Marshall Islands, obviously they were a big focus of both the events here. And what you just said about the senator and just saying that was quite nice. But there was also this element at the conference about, I don't know, there was different people there representing Marshall Islands, but there was almost this resignation too, is that, okay, sea level rise is going to swamp the island. And there was almost a matter of factness about it. And some people were talking about places that in the United States that they might go. And so there was kind of sometimes there's these opposing thoughts, which I thought was really interesting because they were being very practical. They were, I don't know if resigned is the right word. There wasn't that kind of like melancholy to it, but it's just practicalness.
Yeah, and I think that came through, at least to me, from Senator Kitlan Kabua's plenary session, the opening plenary session, kind of acknowledging that, yes, there is this reality, but simultaneously, how can we think about where could people retreat to some of these islands that are a slightly higher elevation, and what would it cost to fortify some of those areas to accommodate a greater number of people coming from other islands? So yeah, you're right. There was a bit of a tension there and an acknowledgement of both scenarios. But I think that it's first and foremost this idea that let's not just go to the fact that we have to move. First, let's think about what would a right to remain look like and how could we make that happen with, of course, international support financially and in other regards as well, because that can't, happen just from the Marshall Islands themselves. I mean, the amount of, I can't remember the exact price tag, but I think it was something like $35 billion for fortifying the islands. I can't, don't quote me on that, but it was somewhere around there.
Yeah, and I thought it was very interesting. And for other reasons, people from the Marshall Islands have already migrated to Arkansas, of all places. And I just thought that was a little interesting bit of history of how you could something so radically different from the Marshall Islands. And so, all right, let's pivot a little bit here. And I want to talk about the Picard event. And you were able to participate in that too. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, Picard, I thought was a fantastic conference. I really liked the combination of hearing from individual people at the first half of the conference and then, different presentations and sessions like that. And then the lightning rounds with various presenters talking about tools, techniques, technology, both kind of, tangible and intangible adaptation solutions that really, I mean, it was kind of like drinking water from a fire hose because of the amount of information we received, but some really fascinating adaptation projects that are being proposed or developed or prototyped across a range of technologies and solutions.
Yeah, and those are that lightning round. We got so much, but can you give us one or two that really stood out for you?
Yeah, I thought the nano-etched cooling film, which I believe came from somebody based out of Australia, was pretty interesting. That's a cooling film that can be applied to cars, shipping container or supply boxing for supplies, greenhouses, even clothing, and it doesn't require electricity. Basically a film that can be put on top of something and then brings the temperature down, on that, whatever it's applied to. And another one that I thought was really interesting were the climate adaptive shelters from the Applied Hope Foundation, Dan Kenny. And that was looking at putting those on the Kwajalein Atoll as a research station. And I think it was called the Jabaki Nest. There was a floating homestead and research station concept that I thought were both really neat.
Yeah, and what was just kind of interesting to me, obviously the Marshall Islands and the Pacific Islands were just a big focus of that, but it's so much of that tech. I'm like, well, that has applications almost anywhere. And so I was encouraged by it, but it just seemed so focused on, but I guess that's what they were sort of asked to do. But I was very encouraged that this kind of thinking is happening all over the place.
Yeah, and seeing how and where it could be applied beyond this context. But yes, I mean, the focus was surely right there for this conference, but I could see it already, across other Pacific Island nations and well beyond for some of these techniques. There was the water aid and renewable power system, the warp system. Yeah, just lots of different techniques that could be used elsewhere.
You did some travel after this conference, and I think that the conference hopefully informed what you were doing there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the really fantastic thing that happened for me out of both of these conferences was that in the second season of the adaptation series that I'm currently in pre-production and soon production on, we have decided now to include the sixth and final episode on the Marshall Islands. And that ties back to what I was saying earlier about their national adaptation plan, which Senator Kitlan Kabua spoke about. Many countries have been asked to put together national adaptation plans, and several do and have, but there is something very unique about the Marshall Islands National Adaptation Plan. And that is because it's not just a policy document, it is really a survival guide. And there are 9 principles that outline what that would look like. What does a national adaptation plan look like for the Marshall Islands? It was a highly participatory process. It involved people from many different islands weighing in, sharing their perspectives on what was both desirable and or feasible. And I think that story of what it means to put together a national adaptation plan in this participatory way that is reflective of the identities and perspectives of everybody in a given place, or as best it can be. And furthermore, that is not just a policy document, like I said, but really this guide, the survival guide for the future that lays out several scenarios and visions of what could be, I thought was just an incredibly compelling story. And I think that for the 6th and final episode of season 2, I'm hoping to share that story and kind of document what are those 9 principles? What do they look like if they, are to be played out on the ground? And so that's what we're going to be doing for the 2nd season. So that was a very, very cool outcome of all this.
You'd mentioned this and you'd been on my podcast before, and we talked about climatopias, and then, the PBS special obviously was a big part of that conversation. But could you elaborate a bit further for my listeners? What is a climatopia?
Yes. So a climatopia is a word that I've coined as a part of this was my dissertation research to describe the rise of utopic aspirational planning for climate change in the built environment. And a climatopia has to have 2 things. One, a climate response. So it could be either an adaptation or a mitigation focus, and ideally in some cases both. And then the second dimension that has to be present for a climatopia is a vision for socio-political transformation. And that's a really key aspect, because a lot of utopias and utopic visions are visions for a radically transformed future. And that touches not just the physical space. It's not just a LEED certified building, for example, but really something that says, how is this impacting your political, economic, and social aspects of daily life? And so my research was really examining what are these manifestations of climate utopic proposals, and what are the ones that are really offering deeply and truly socio-political transformation to inhabitants, so that we can get out of some of these unsustainable and highly extractive modes of production and existence. So I will say a climatopia, there are lots of so-called climatopias, or these seeming climatopias that we see with the proliferation of glossy imagery. I'm sure many of your listeners have seen them, whether it's the Saudi Arabian NEOM style projects, or maybe in China, some of the green cities and forest city concepts, and across Asia. I mean, really everywhere that you cross Africa, pretty much across most continents where you've got big urban centers, you're going to be finding some of these types of designs. And so my research was really an examination of how many of these are truly offering the real transformation versus those that are just offering, glossy imagery that presents as something transformative, but ultimately is perhaps just a distraction.
All right. So I'm curious, because as Climatopias, as you're looking at the sort of broader adoption of adaptation, what did you think that these two events were hosted by the U.S. Department of Defense? Was that surprising to you that the DoD was thinking like this? And do you think that's going to inform some of your Climatopia work?
That's a great question. I would like to think so. Yeah. And I do think that some of the solutions that we saw during the lightning round, specifically for Picard, did demonstrate a lot of very forward-looking ideas. I will say I found some of them to be pretty tech heavy, and I don't think that there's a silver bullet there in every scenario. And I think we should also be looking at some of the more social infrastructure and, intangible dimensions of adaptation for the future that are like things around policy and legal changes that can in some ways be, arguably much more effective and sustainable over the long term than just a technological fix. So yes, I was excited to see some things, but I would say moving forward, we might also want to be thinking a little bit more about those other aspects.
Okay. Last question. If people want to learn more about what you're doing and just, I guess a preview of some of this other work that you're doing.
Yeah. So my Climatopia research is just about to be published with two co-authors, the people that I mentioned earlier, my committee chairs, Dr. Catherine Mock and Dr. Kenneth Broad. Those papers should hopefully be coming out soon. And as I'm working on the second season of the adaptation series, that could definitely take a little bit longer because we've got a lot of locations to go to, and we'll be busily running around mostly the U.S. The stories are primarily based in the United States for this second season, with the exception of the Marshall Islands. So keep an eye out for that, probably closer to 2026. And you can go to my website, alizecarrere.com.
Alize, it's always a pleasure having you on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doug.
Hey, Adapters, we're going to close out this episode with Kate Plimpton, who you heard at the very beginning of the episode. Welcome back, Kate.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to wrap up this discussion, and I want to get some more thoughts from you because we had these two great events, KHA and Picard, and we've learned all about them and people that have been participating in those events. So let's just start off with the KHA event. What were some of the highlights for you?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we need more time. I was really inspired by the resilience and the determination of the Marshallese. Solin Bayo, who was a speaker, she was a curator at the Alley Museum, told a story about her daughter asking if she can learn to swim. Can she stay on Majuro when the water comes? During the panel, speakers noted that you have to be vulnerable when you're doing something good for the community because there's no promise that will come back to you. And for the DoD, we need to recognize that in the past, we have been adversarial, whether it had been intentional or not. There's been so much generational trauma, and yet these folks still show up. They still share their stories. They're still partnering with the department because they understand that's how you build community. The only way to solve these complex problems is to show up, to be vulnerable, and to be willing to work together. Climate change and coastal inundation is something we're all going to have to work on. No one gets to sit on the sidelines. And the folks in the Pacific Islands, Hawaii, Guam, the Marshall Islands are doing just that. It's really impressive.
Let's talk a bit more, and you talked about this at the very beginning, and there's culture preservation, cultural resources. There's these subtleties to it. A lot of times people just think of these buildings, but when cultural resources can just be traditions and such. And so how did those conversations come up, and how did you absorb those?
Yeah, when we look at cultural preservation and then this context, we're really looking at the protection of cultural properties. And those properties could be buildings, structures, sites, religious or sacred sites, culturally important plants or animals, intangible things like language, dance, song, etc. It's important that we don't overlook some of these intangible history. The folks in the Marshall Islands, for example, are looking at having to leave their island within 30 to 50 years. That's the loss of all of their cultural history, not just the tangible items that are obvious on the landscape. And I think it's really important that we focus on all of that, because if you have to leave a location, if you have to relocate, if you have a significant loss of physical property due to climate change or extreme weather events, securing and protecting those intangible can allow your history and your culture to live on, even in a location that might be different or new.
One of the things that I was thinking when I was there, and there was all these great presentations and very technical things, but we just heard about what people are dealing with. What are you guys going to do with this information at DoD?
We've already started a lot of stuff in that vein. We're already working pretty hard on the solution. on these issues. The DoD has made it really clear the strategic importance of the freely associated states and the importance of the Pacific in our national security strategy and our national defense strategy. And so we need a robust and mutually beneficial relationship with the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Island leaders identified the need for greater access to and training on environmental and climate information so that they can strengthen their response to the impacts of climate change. And to help meet that need, the DoD is committed to developing climate dashboards. So we've recently completed one for 2 islands on the Kwajalein Atoll, Ibai and Roinamur, and we've completed similar dashboards for folks in Guam. And we'll be continuing working on that process. We're also looking specifically at the KEHA event and what do we do next? And so we're working with policy and partners in the Pacific on how we can continue to engage. The overwhelming result from our KEHA participants was that it was great, but that we needed more time. And so that's something we knew going into it, but it's really great to hear that people thought it was a beneficial conversation and worth continuing. The next step for us is to develop a longer event that would allow us to engage with scientific and cultural leaders and the DoD. We're hoping to do that through a mixture of workshops, conversations like we had in Hawaii, as well as real and tabletop exercises. So the goal is for us to be able to focus on the outcomes and not just on the conversations. So more soon.
If people want to learn more about what you're up to, what do you recommend? And these events that you're potentially going to be putting on at DoD, are these things that other folks can participate in if they're reaching out to you? How does that all work?
Absolutely. So all the information from KEHA is on our website. We have a dedicated page that has the videos of the sessions we were able to record, as well as webinars that have happened since, as well as all of the case studies and the presentations from all of the speakers. That same information is also on the Newport Restoration Foundation website. And so right now we're interested in talking to people that want to partner in the Pacific, that have ideas about partnering the Pacific. There's contact information on our website, so we'd welcome you guys to reach out. We absolutely need to hear from folks to see what's significant and what's important to them before we can decide what to talk about next.
Kate, thanks again for partnering with America Adapts. It was a fantastic experience for me, and thanks for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for being there. We really appreciate your attendance as well.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated in this episode. I learned a ton on how island communities have their own unique challenges to adapt to climate change. And it was also exciting to hear how Indigenous perspectives can provide unique approaches to adaptation. Thanks to the U.S. Department of Defense for sponsoring this episode. It never ceases to amaze me the scope of issues and communities they work with. Thanks to Kate Plimpton for bringing me on board, and especially the SERDP research program at DoD. Definitely check out the show notes to learn more about their symposium coming up in DC. If you want to learn about cutting-edge adaptation tech, the symposium has you covered. And definitely reach out to the experts in this episode if you have ideas or want to learn more. And that was my first time in Hawaii. What a beautiful and fascinating place. And yes, on the front lines of climate change. Okay, Adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.